All right, welcome. This is the SIG Auth meeting for October 4th, 2017. Got a pretty full agenda, so we'll go ahead and jump in. Before we get to demos and designs and planning, are there any announcements that people have or would like to make? The only one I'm aware of is the retrospective for the 1.8 release that is scheduled for later this week. So if you have feedback on the release or things since the release, I'd encourage you to add those to that doc and attend the meeting so we can do a better job in the next release. Anything else? And I will add the link after the meeting. All right, hearing none. I had a demo that I wanted to do of a tool that I wrote that took advantage of some of the work that happened in 1.8 around auditing. So this is a tool that I am shamelessly stealing the name from Audit to Allow. So it consumes Kubernetes audit logs and takes a username and looks for things that that user did and generates RBAC roles and bindings for that user that covers the things that that user attempted to do. And so I wanted to demo that real quick. So I have a cluster running just locally and set it to output audit events and defined an audit policy, a really basic one that just captures metadata about requests from these users. And then I have, well, let's see. So the audit to RBAC tool takes the log, the user or service account that you want to generate policies for, and then some extra options. And it's pretty basic right now, but I have some ideas in the future. But if I just run this in a loop and have Jordan, it,
yep, we're only seeing the SIG agenda right now.
Oh, really?
I'm seeing Jordan's terminal.
I'm also seeing Jordan's terminal.
just me then.
Great. Well, you can watch the recording. How about that? If you run this in a loop, I'm going to run it in a loop and dump the output to a file on disk. And so every couple of seconds it's going to look at that log. And as soon as I do something as one of these users, so I'm going to try to get pods as that service account. And you can see that an audit event got captured and the tool saw that and generated a role that let me get pods in the default namespace. So I didn't specify a namespace, so I was getting them in the default namespace. So you'll notice a few things. The tool is smart enough to say, if you're allowed to list pods, then there's no reason to not also let you get and watch pods. Those are typically granted together. That's something that I expect to be able to control in the future and say I want to expand verbs or not, but this is kind of codifying some best practices. So those set of permissions are typically granted together. It's only letting you get them in the default namespace. So I only got pods in the default namespace, so it's only going to grant or generate a role that lets you get them in the default namespace. If I tried to get them in some other namespace, first of all, I get forbidden because that service account didn't have permission to do it. But you'll notice that over here, the audit events for getting pods in 2 different namespaces were noticed. And the tool said, well, if you're allowed to list pods in multiple namespaces, typically that means you're doing it at the cluster level. And so it actually changed it from being a role in one particular namespace up to a cluster role across all namespaces. And again, this would be something you could say, I want you to do these auto expanding options or not. And so something I have running in the background is an apply loop. So this role definition that I've been auto-generating, I am also auto-applying. And so if I try to do that thing that I just did and got forbidden, I am now allowed to do it. And so you could imagine sort of this three-step process. A user or an application tries to do things, those audit events get captured and roles get generated from those. And then those auto-generated roles could be audited or could go into an automatic apply loop and be audited later. It's basically a really nice way to quickly develop roles that cover the behavior that an app or a user requires. And so you could run this locally in a dev cluster and then take those generated roles, audit them, and apply them to a reduction system. So, and you can see this works for different actions as well. Well, anyway, that's the core of the demo. The audit, feeding, role generation, feeding, applying, looping back to automatically allow the system. And the nice thing about triggering this off of the audit logs is that we have audit logs whether or not the initial action was permitted. So in this case, I tried to do something, got forbidden, but the information that I tried to do it was still captured. So you can decide for yourself whether you want to kind of give this thing elevated permissions while you're in the role development phase and just let it do what it needs to do and build a role that way, or if you want it to be denied until the role gets audited and applied. So you can work either way. So yeah, so I'd encourage you to pull it down, check it out. Like I said, I have lots of things I want to go add to it, but it's pretty useful already. I was able to run it on a typical cluster and build roles for some of the core components like scheduler and some of the other things that look essentially like what took me hours to build in the 1.6 timeframe by hand. So that was pretty cool.
Very cool. Thanks for working on this.
So now, for somebody to use this, they need to install an audit handler, right?
The log handler that's built in works. So that's what I'm using.
So the log handler. So you're reading. You're doing a watch on that then?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. So you don't need any special sort of like this would work with GKE supposedly. I mean, allegedly.
If you could get GKE audit logs, yeah.
Well, I guess yeah. I mean, some of this is how do we get to the point where tools like this can be used across all clusters, including GKE? And I think that
right.
I'm
not sure what the GKE plan is, whether they're planning to actually expose the audit logs or allow you to register audit handlers that you could dump to a log. I'm not sure what the plan for GKE specifically is.
But it would be great if we had sort of a generic way to hook in and get audit logs across lots of clusters installs.
Absolutely.
Cool. Very cool.
All right. I apologize. I didn't have time to fill in the polls of note, designs of note. So this is not to say that nothing has been happening. It's just to say that I ran out of time prepping the agenda. So I apologize. I know there were a few issues that came around the 1.8 release around cert rotation that impacted kubeadm and some things that we might want to take a look at, but I think that would probably be better done in a retrospective type setting where people have time to look at them and prep. So we can mention them here, but I think it might be a good idea at the next meeting to kind of take a retrospective once we get a little bit of distance from the 1.8 release churn and have some time to gather our thoughts on that. For the designs, the primary one that I'm interested in that I'd like to get early feedback on is one that we've talked about a few times before, which is the reduced scope on node object and the KMS provider. Those are the two that seem closest to being actionable for 1.9. Some of Mike's JWT minting ones are also important, but I think might be a little further out from implementation. So I'm going to just
the KMS
hoist those up.
The KMS provider, we've been through a couple rounds of asking if anyone had more comments. Questions have already been addressed. There are 2 typos that I know that are outstanding, and after that, I think it's going to be good to merge.
Okay.
We already interlocked with API machinery and got agreement there as well.
Okay, great. So
okay, I'll get those typos fixed, and thanks to David for his help.
Yeah.
So the primary thing that I want to do with the reduced scope of node on node is to work with probably Mike and some of the folks in SIG node to just agree on a strategy going forward so that the node isn't blocked on what it needs to do, but people who also are trying to partition their cluster can understand what they can what they can trust and not trust if they're trying to protect from things that nodes could set. So that will probably end up looking like a prefix on labels and taints, and anything under that prefix, nodes can set whatever they want. But if an admin is trying to partition their cluster, they would need to do it on something outside the node's control. We just have to be pragmatic to not block SIG node work, but also accommodate node partitioning. So, all right, were there other designs that people wanted to call out? I'll go ahead and copy the one from Mike as well. I don't see him on. I don't think he's on the call. But this is related to some of the container identity work that's going on. It's not exactly the same, but it's related, which is as more things desire identity for a broader variety of reasons, not just talking to the Kube API, I think we want to get ahead of the instinct to just reuse the Kube API tokens as credentials for other services. That's not something we want to encourage, but so we want to have a recommendation, either one that's actually part of Kube or a recommendation with actual implementations for alternatives, or people are going to start using Kube API tokens to authenticate to other things, even though they shouldn't.
And I think it also, just on the container identity side, I think it also is one possible path for a pluggable identity thing. So it's worth looking into if you're interested in that work.
So my biggest,
having a really hard time hearing. Is that just me?
I think CJ's quiet.
Sorry about that. Did you guys hear what I said?
Nope.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I think my hand may have been on my mic. All right. I was just saying Mike's design is sort of one possible path for a pluggable identity, or one route. So it's worth looking into, even if you're not specifically interested in passing JWTs around to places.
Yeah, although the more built in it is to the server and API, the less pluggable it seems, and more like this is the one true way and everyone else is a plugin. So
So my biggest concern here, and I apologize, Mike, this is not something I've expressed before this, is one of availability. Generally, so much of Kubernetes, if the control plane is down, things continue to cruise. If you need the API server to mint new JWTs, because these things are pairwise and it's like n squared with the number of services talking to services, or n by m, then that requires a higher level of availability for the API server than we've seen in the past. And so because it's all centralized like that, that's something that I think we should at least.
I think that's true of only one of the models. So in the doc, there are 2 models, and that is a attribute of only one of the models. Have you reviewed the doc yet?
I have, but there's a lot there, and it might have changed since last I reviewed it. So, or maybe I misunderstood that. So I'll definitely look through it with that in mind.
But yes, availability is considered in the doc and discussed in the doc, and the two models have different guarantees of availability.
Yeah, I see that now.
The centralized model, were you proposing that we require the API server, or that we make the API server start minting these, or is that only one of multiple potential centralized options, right? Running it in a pod or something being a different option.
It would be a Kubernetes API, either in the authentication API group or potentially using the kube aggregation framework.
Yeah, I think this may be something like where we want to get, as we get a little bit more formal with like trying to like pull this together. One of the things in my mind would be, I wanted to see someone, like I had started pulling together a quick example of moving service accounts out of the API by using an initializer to inject a flex volume, which then is capable of calling into this. I think like we want to, before we get out of 1.9, really be able to both drive feedback and requirements to API machinery, but also to identify for ourselves all the places that these things are too coupled and have a good write-up and path for SIG Auth to help people decouple some of these things while still remaining available.
I guess the question is, do we want workloads to have a strong principal identity, or is that going to be bolted on?
Well, I think you can still have, I think you can have both. I think bolting on is almost orthogonal if we do it right. The question is should, like, I mean, just pragmatically, I think there's some level of, even if we all agree, like on this call, that the right thing to do is to put something new into Kube, the right thing for us to do as a project is to do it plugged into Kube in a very particular way and still be available, right?
Yeah, so I would say that we need to not conflate the strong principal identity with the way of that a workload identifies as that identity. Would you say that is correct? So I guess the distinction should be made between service accounts and service account tokens.
Yes, service accounts, for the better or worse, is still part of our API for a very long time. Service account tokens, ideally, the mechanisms whereby pods get access to a token is somewhat, the mechanisms and the details in the verification path. We try to focus on the preserving the use cases we have while gradually making them better. I don't think that's, I'm not disagreeing with anything you're saying, actually. Just like the focus is on, if we can show these things being split out, we start pushing the whole project in the right direction.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one way of doing that is to experiment with a centralized JOT minter outside of Kubernetes core using the aggregation framework.
And that was actually basically what I was looking to work with somebody on to prototype. Maybe like that's something, Mike, you and I can talk more about afterwards. Like I had started to work at the flex volume side for injecting JOTs or private identities, but forcing to use the extension mechanisms, authorizer, initializer, API aggregation, flex volume, and there's one more. To go through that exercise of, if it can't be done, we don't have good enough extension mechanisms.
Yeah, and I don't intend that JOTs are the root of identity. I think that they are definitely going to be part of the extension mechanism, or they are going to be an extension. What the intent was with the JOT minter and the verifiable workload JOTs is to give us a way of interacting with third-party or external identity providers, and gives us something that we can start to work on now that is achievable before the pod identity settles. I wanted to figure out what we could do outside of the critical path of pod identity. or to remove pod identity from the critical path. This seems like a way forward. I don't know if you guys saw the Vault Kubernetes integration.
Yeah.
So that essentially what that integration is doing is you take the service count jot and you send it to Vault. And I think this is an okay approach because generally Vault is
No.
It's not an okay approach.
All right, so hear me out.
We can talk about that later, but
hear me out.
I have a discussion topic later on that.
It's an okay approach, assuming that you trust Vault more than you trust the Kubernetes API. I think for a lot of people this is true. It's not a sustainable approach. So for something like a Vault integration, the Jot Minter would greatly improve our story there, and it's a fairly easy integration to make with other external identity providers or external resource servers.
And by the way, just as a heads up, my name is Andy Minoski. I'm the product manager for Vault. So just to clarify, the integration point that we have with Vault is in like an initial rev. So stuff like this is definitely things that we're interested in learning about as we try to iron out better ways to integrate within the authentication infrastructure for Kubernetes.
Yeah, and don't take the comments to, I mean, it's not like there's a better option for you to integrate right now. So the goal is to figure out how to make there be a better option and a better approach.
Think of better options that could have integrated. But I think for now, I think the one thing, and I'm looking through this now to make sure, Mike, is the whole audience thing. And I the big thing is like, who are we minting this jot for? And then how do we actually enforce that when people verify the jot, they're actually verifying it in a way that makes these things be pairwise instead of being able to sort of pass them around. And I think that's going to be an important part of the ecosystem here if this becomes something that gets used widely.
Yeah. So back to the Vault integration. I think that the existence of this API would make the Vault integration solid.
Assuming that we had the audience stuff scoped out well.
Well, the audience is basically the audience and expiration are the two things that this design doc adds.
Right, I'm looking at, so right now, the only place we're using audience is for integration with GCP service accounts?
We are not using audience at all. Audience is a field that the requester of a jot requests as part of getting
I'm
the jot
looking
set
at the
up.
examples in the doc now. The only places where I see the examples in the jot now are using the audience to
There are two integrations. One integration is Vault and one integration is GCP. Those are example integrations. But basically what happens is when you talk to a API that trusts you, or the jot API that trusts you, you prove yourself to the jot API and you say, I need a jot for this amount of time and I'm going to send it to this person. So audience is is requested by the requester of the jot, and you aim your audience to who you expect to send the jot to.
I understand that. I just think that for this to be successful, we have to essentially teach users that these jots end up being pairwise tokens, and that they need to coordinate and validate the audience and expiration fields on this.
I think we need to give our external identity providers that want to integrate with us a little credit, and to assume that they have some understanding of how authentication works and authentication standards.
No, I'm not worried about them. I'm worried about other folks that are going to follow this pattern. I think, if we have two services talking to each other and they're using these things, the general pattern is just copy paste some code that looks to work, and as you copy paste that code, making sure that you use a unique audience per target is going to be an important part of it. And so just thinking in terms of the ecosystem and sort of how do we, as this gets used widely outside of folks who are more careful, like say Vault, how do we make sure that we encourage good patterns? That's
Yeah.
And that's actually a really good point, Joe. Like, I think we talked about this a little bit, the last container identity, but an example of this might be, it should be really easy to spin up a pod that gets a jot for a specific audience injected as a file at a location you request, hypothetically.
Well, and as we, if we do this integration using something like flex volumes, it's kind of a one-way communication. And so specifying all the audiences that you might want to talk to up front, maybe in your manifest, is going to be problematic versus actually saying, well, now I want to talk to this new audience, give me a new job for that. And so I think that's one advantage of sort of the lay the creds down on disk approach versus the offer another API approach.
No, but the flex volume would lay it down on disk. That's the key point.
Right, I know, but the thing is that requires users to specify probably in their pod manifest the audiences that they want to talk to, because then that defines what gets laid down on disk.
But that's a very static approach, Joe.
What's that?
Sorry, that's a very static approach. This is KK. If you were to lay down which audiences I want to talk to, that can work for a limited set of use cases. But if I want to go outside that pod set and want to talk to someone new that's not there in my manifest.
Yeah, I was mostly approaching this from when we think about how we do this, it's this trying to find mechanisms that force people to not give their service account token out.
Yes, that's bad.
Yeah, and like the flex volume approach, at least one of them is that we can do examples that show a flex volume with an audience. I'm not saying audience is going to take over the world. Another one is like client cert, which is in both of those examples, we want to try to find ways to make the pattern that you're highlighting be sustainable versus.
Yeah.
We definitely don't want to put, for instance, a flex volume that lays down a private key that then people start using for everything without at least thinking about it. And we definitely don't want to lay down the dots that everybody can see. Absolutely. Yeah,
and I'm just thinking as we move towards more sort of meshes of things calling other things, how does this actually grow? When I'm calling 50 services, does that mean the flex volume is going to have 50 different jots and I'm going to index into that?
I don't think these jots are not intended to be used as bearer tokens for service to service communication.
Well, that's essentially what's happening, with say the Vault case.
No, it's not. Vault you exchange for an access token. So you exchange this with an external identity provider for an access token. So the doc explicitly states.
So I have an identity in Kubernetes, which is my service account, and I want to actually use that identity to authenticate myself against Vault. Now Vault's happening to give me secrets, and maybe we have other like sort of intermediate mechanisms, but it's essentially a pairwise identity translation, right? It's a bearer token to Vault, right?
Yeah, a one-shot bearer token. Is still a bearer token.
Is it one shot even? It has there's no nonce in there.
So essentially, I don't intend for these jots to be used against research servers. I intend for them to be used against authentication servers.
Well, it doesn't matter what you intend, it's what people are going to use it for. I mean, like this is why my topic later on is let's talk about the token review API, because there was an intent there, but it got used for other things.
Well, and maybe as a concrete thing here, like we actually do need a case where you can get an identity proving token that the server does something better than what it does today, which is let unauthenticated users verify tokens and verify that they're at. Like, I don't feel like we're that far apart though. Like we want a way to have limited scope authenticators that conceivably when used as a token review would correspond to the person who is asking for the token review. Is that fair?
I feel like we need to map out A's and B's and C's and E's and stuff. I'm not sure I understand exactly.
So to unwind a couple of levels, like one of the things I really would love to see by the end of 1.9 is we have 3 or 4 different concrete examples of doing a fairly approachable Go code at 3 or 4 different levels of doing things like injecting, taking service accounts out of tree and injecting them into pods transparently as the initializer / just basically moving that all out of the API server, injecting tokens that can be used to exchange for identity with the API server, not the things that Mike's talking about with an aggregator API and some better designs around that. The additional sets of things that have been discussed in the container identity group, like getting to a point where we actually have a lot of simple working examples that can be composed. Like I feel like that would be a good step for 1.9.
Yeah.
And by the way, you said you asked if the JOTs have a nonce, and they do have a nonce.
Do they have a nonce? Okay, did I miss that? I missed that.
Yes, you did miss that.
I apologize.
There's another place that this similar pattern.
That does make them one shot. Okay.
Which is the Kubernetes Dashboard, which does sort of the similar thing that Vault's doing, where it expects you to give it your Kubernetes API credential, and then it replays that credential to authenticate to. It uses it to actually call the impersonation API. But it's another case where you really would like to talk to the API and like generate a token that's only valid for the dashboard, that the dashboard can't then necessarily, I don't know, that feels kind of messy and similar, but it's also different enough from the service account use case, because in that case you have humans that are using the dashboard.
Yeah. All right. It's 2:30. Let's continue to discuss this, but not in this meeting. Wanted to really quick get a sense for what people are looking at working on for 1.9. The 1.9 release is actually really short. So the schedule is still being discussed, but it looks like they're proposing early December release. So that's 2 months, which is basically a month of dev time starting now. My guess is that things that are currently in progress and pretty well scoped is all that we're going to make in 1.9. So I just wanted to go through this list pretty quick. There's some, be good to have names associated with all of these. Some of these cross-SIG issues would be good to identify specific people we can coordinate with. But I know Tim and I are working on pod security policy, getting that a couple last issues around undefined behavior with multiple matching policies ironed out. And Tim and Greg had been working on policies for GCE, GKE for about a release now, but had been blocked by some of the API issues. So I've got polls open to resolve and define the behavior when multiple policies match. And Tim has a poll open with policies that would let us enable this in CI, E2E runs, which is a big step. That's a good thing to do. And the kind of big question mark I had, I know we are trying to remove the extensions API group, and pod security policies still live in that API group. And so like all the other objects that started life there, they will need to move to an appropriate API group. And I wasn't sure what that would be. We have the policy API group, which currently has pod disruption budget objects. So it kind of made sense. It's pod related API policy objects. I wasn't sure if other people had opinions or.
Yeah, if we start putting, well, I don't know, policy becomes, I have a policy for doing everything. You could have just as well put RBAC there.
Yeah, I talked myself into, this is policies around pods, but maybe I just am good at convincing myself.
Yeah, that sounds like a API group.
But if we have one API group for every API, I'm going to kill somebody.
Yeah.
And I mean, so maybe we should say, we definitely only want to put things in the same group if they're logically related and we can convince ourselves that they are fundamental to Kubernetes and logically fundamental to each other. Like, you're right, like the bucket of policy for anything that's pod related gets ugly. Disruption budget is pretty fundamental to workload scheduling. And we said that is a key enabler for everything else in the system. Is pod security policy a fundamental enabler for how you do run workloads safely? I mean, whether it's policy or authorization, it does sound somewhat fundamental.
I don't know. Anyway, I would, if you have ideas, add them here, or we can discuss them in. I'll probably start an issue to track this as well. But that's kind of the least well-defined thing that I think we would like to at least start making progress on in 1.9. The next item was the node label and taint restriction, and I actually split the label and taint restriction out from the address restriction because I think the label and taint restriction is much better scoped and has a pretty reasonable path forward. The address restriction stuff gets into like cloud provider, like who's the authority of the addresses on the node? Is it node controller or cloud provider? What do you do in non-cloud provider situations? It's just a little messier. So I actually split those into two. And I think Mike and I will probably be driving the label and taint restriction bits from SIG Auth. If anyone else is interested, jump into that feature. And we need to identify someone in SIG node and SIG scheduling.
Now, this is for controlling policy on nodes setting their own labels and taints versus controlling policy of how labels and taints get set on pods, right?
Yeah.
Which is a different policy piece. Okay, cool.
Yeah. This is like minimal, keep one compromised node from taking over the world, and then we'll catch our breath and see what we can do generally. David, you want to talk about the cluster roles?
Yeah, so one of the, RBAC has been great, but one of the problems we've had with it has to do with I add a custom resource definition or I add a user API server. Now I have new resources and I want to be able to provide RBAC rules around them, and I would really like to have a normal admin role do what I want it to do, where I have an admin for a namespace and now I add an operator to it, and an admin for that namespace should be able to create one. So there's been discussion in the message board. I will be putting together a doc describing how we could fix it so that we can actually provide a path forward for people trying to extend the API server.
So in a nutshell, it's role aggregation is what you're proposing, right?
That's probably what I'm going to end up trying to do, yeah.
All right, and then you had tagged the next one. So that was the KMS, the Vault KMS provider that already had a proposal in pull that is well along in review.
Yeah, it's well along in review and been coordinated with API machinery.
Okay. And then Matt, do you want to talk about the AWS?
This is a lot more tentative, but there's an open issue around doing the same thing for AWS KMS.
Okay.
Which it should be a much smaller project than Vault was.
Yeah, I think there's going to be some resistance from API machinery, Daniel in particular, on that.
I discussed we had a discussion with Daniel here as well too, and we talked about the kind of out of process extension point and making that, so there's an open issue for that, which we also discussed at last SIG Auth. So I think the agreement was that Vault could go in as like a, getting a second implementation of this thing is a good thing, but there's definitely going to be resistance to more of them without this extra kind of out of process API. Having said that, I don't think the API is super complicated, and so Jacob on our side is going to take a look at working on that this quarter. But if there's others that kind of are potentially going to be blocked by that, then they'd probably want to think about helping out and helping drive that too.
That's why I left this as tentative, because I know there's
there's also a bug filed for an Azure version as well too. I'm not sure if that's actively being worked on, but there is a bug open.
All right, do you mind kind of adding a note with names of folks who were looking at the out of process one? I think if we want to ask people to wait for a out of process method, we at least need to be clear about the process or the progress and kind of expected arrival date of that.
Yep, I'll do that.
Thanks. All right, Tim, you want to describe the container isolation stuff?
Sure. This is just very early stages. I want to make some improvements to our current container isolation story. A lot of it's kind of grown ad hoc over the years and is very hard to use. Some of it feels sort of bolted on. And so I'd like to take a step back and figure out how all the pieces fit together. What is the kind of what is the story we want to build around that? How do things like VM-based pods fit into that? And so I'm hoping that this release, it's not really part of the release exactly, but to put out some kind of design vision type documents. So if anyone's interested in this topic, please reach out to me.
Also suggest kind of pulling in the existing security hardening doc that Clayton wrote and maybe tying it into the defense in depth issue that got opened.
Yeah, definitely.
Letting those be feedback into this. Wow, we're an ambitious bunch. Gonna get all this done in the next month, huh? All right. One thing that I noticed here, or it wasn't here, was some of the cert rotation, client cert rotation stuff. I know that we kind of hit some issues around the 1.8 release, and I know Clayton has been digging into looking into using it on the OpenShift side and how to pull open with some changes. Jacob or Mike, do you know? Did you have plans to look at this more in the 1.9 release? This is around the client cert rotation specifically.
Yeah, this is Jacob. I'm still working on this. I missed whatever open issue there is about this. Somebody wants to send that to me or make a reference. I'll see what I can get some more contacts on that. But we're still working on this and adding to it. I didn't add any information. I didn't add the link in time, but we do have a significant pull request for a new controller to clean up old certificates. And it is up in the links for this meeting.
I think there's a lot of testing to be done around the specific failures that Clayton started to uncover. And one of the open questions is how to fall back once the kubelet client certificate is expired. So these are things to ponder over the next release or two while the API is still beta, and they're definitely on our radar to figure out.
Yeah, I think one thing we want to be careful about is communicating well with other teams about what beta means. So kubeadm in particular enabled this in 1.8, and some of the behavior, the issue I know of in particular, when a kubelet started up, even if it had a good client cert, it would actually rotate and block on rotation. And so I'm not sure if that was wrong, but it was certainly unexpected. And so just doing a good job of coordinating with other teams, because beta can mean a lot of different things. And it doesn't always mean you should definitely turn this on without testing it. So we just want to have good documentation around like what's required, what are the limitations, what should you do if you want to enable this feature.
Wasn't the issue with kubeadmin related to the default setting for the certificate directory was actually a deletable directory, and every time they rebooted, the existing certificates were deleted?
There were three issues. One was that the upgrade instructions didn't add the permissions for a node to automatically rotate its client cert. And so you had to go approve it manually. So on the very first start, the node would start up and try to rotate and then block, waiting for manual approval. Once we got past that, then we hit the it's persisting them in a transient directory that goes away on reboot issue. It's been a fun week.
Okay.
All right, so I'm just going to say better define failure modes, fallback.
While I have everybody in one room, I think I've talked to Jacob about this, and I mentioned it to Jordan the other day. I was considering using instead of reusing the kubelet client certificate to, as part of rotation, always use a separate identity to re-request kubelet client certificates. Do you remember talking about this, Jacob?
Yeah, I do remember. In the context of the current implementation, we would essentially be using the original certificate and using that to request the new certificates. However, the idea is that a better implementation would make the original certificate replaced by a better mechanism. Like on GCP, it would be some information about the node itself that would allow us to authenticate instead of trying to use that long-lived certificate. But the idea would, instead of being perpetually renewing based on the existing certificate.
Yeah, I mean, using attestation or additional verifications on that Bootstrap credential was something that was talked about from the beginning of the Bootstrap flow. So, I mean, I'd like to see progress made in that direction. Again, that kind of gets immediately into like, well, what does it look like on this cloud or that cloud or this provider or that provider? Which isn't to say we can't do it, but I think we need to make progress. I expect that progress to be slow as soon as you hit and then it looks different in every environment type of position.
Right. But the architecture change is we always use a separate identity or I guess it's the node bootstrap identity to request certificates either initially or during rotation.
Well, sometimes that node bootstrap identity will be transient. Right.
Well, so that's why it's poorly named. So I'm talking about the node bootstrap identity as in I'm talking about the node bootstrap role. So the node bootstrap role is a role that allows read and create access to the certificates API. So essentially, the kubelet or the process that builds the kubelet certificates, whenever it needs to refresh or initially create a kubelet certificate, it uses a separate identity. What we have today is after the initial creation of the kubelet certificate, that kubelet certificate assumes that role, and we reuse that kubelet certificate. This poses a problem is if something bad happens, if you are creating kubelet certificates for 2 days and something happens and you couldn't refresh in time, then you're in a position where you're totally broken. And
yeah, I think what this ends up looking like is not necessarily that we stop using a bootstrap token. I think having a token that just lets you create CSRs is okay. What I think we want to get away from is automatically approving those CSRs just based on the token. Because as long as you're doing that, then you really do want to expire or revoke that token as soon as you're done setting up your node group. If we want that token to continue to be valid to submit CSRs long-term or as a fallback or a bedrock case, then we need to be approving those based on something else, like additional data in the CSR that came from an attestation doc that only the node had access to.
Well, it seems like there's two overlapping concerns here. So one of them is enhancing security by making sure that you have that you can take advantage of some sort of out-of-band bedrock attestation, right? And then the other concern is making sure that you don't strand nodes if something happens, you don't actually rotate in time.
Right.
Yeah. So the first concern The second concern is solved by separating these two identities, and the first concern is by hardening the rotation identity.
I mean, I think
well, wait, just a second. If we separate these identities and you don't have some sort of bedrock out-of-band attestation, then that first certificate essentially becomes a long-term credential, and so then why bother rotating?
Well, I'm saying you need to do both.
But you're not always going to have some bedrock attestation to actually fall back on. So what do we do in the case where you have a pile of Raspberry Pis?
So I'm not saying that we cannot get away with one or the other. I'm saying that we need to do both, and both are solved by different improvements.
And I see this as kind of a hierarchy. Like once you've gone from Bootstrap to active client cert, having it try to renew itself seems okay. In the case where it fails, today it just hangs, right? And
okay,
so having a way to go back to the bedrock, and either, you know, if that's expired, well, tough. In a cloud, you can let that be long-lived and pair it with a requirement for attestation. So
okay, so you're imagining, Jordan, that both of these modes would be tried in parallel, the sort of chain renew versus going back to bedrock. Yeah. It sounds like Mike's saying just the bedrock thing.
Well, if you do just the bedrock, then you require the bedrock to be long-lived, which means you're not in a good spot unless you also have like cloud provided attestation docs. So I think we have to be sensitive to environments that don't have that.
Absolutely, I totally agree. But in environments that do support that, we should be able to remove that rotation requirement from the kubelet identity and kubelet credentials.
So it sounds like there's two different modes of rotation. There's go back to bedrock mode, and then there's sort of chain it mode.
Right. And in the environments where you have a solid bedrock that can be used, it's actually much stronger and more aligned with what people are actually doing.
Yeah. As long as we can get good coverage of the good exercise both cases, I don't object to short circuiting if we have a bedrock attestation to go back to. I just want one of the things that we realized this week was we don't have good coverage of this, and people are starting to use it. So whatever paths we let people use, we just need to make sure it works.
Hey, so I want to spend 5 minutes to talk about the discussion item that I put on the end there.
Okay.
So there's this token review API. It's essentially undocumented. My understanding, at least reading the tea leaves, is that it was built for the kubelet, and other folks have started using it.
The API was defined both for delegating token auth out to an IDP and for the kubelet to delegate token auth back to the API server. So it's used.
What was the first case? The first case was delegating to a.
You can configure the API server to say, ask some IDP out somewhere, who does this token represent? So the webhook token authenticator.
And then it calls back to do the token auth?
The API server asks the IDP for user info for a token.
Oh, I see. So somebody else can implement this that's not the API server.
Yep,
gotcha.
Which GKE does.
Gotcha, that makes sense. So it's for external token auth, token review, and then it's also for the kubelet because we don't have a good mechanism short of trusting the kubelet to call back with this stuff, right?
I think this kind of has a weird history, if I recall. CJ, do you remember?
Yeah, I think they got it pretty much right. Like the API object was introduced so that we could have a webhook. Going through that, we didn't really breach the actually serving the API from the API server. And then later it looked like it would be a useful way for kubelets to be able to delegate service account authentication without having to pass around public keys. And
So my question is, any objection of putting some documentation somewhere essentially saying, hey, this is a dangerous API not meant for general consumption, use carefully?
I'd characterize it as it's intended to be used by things that are considered to be the same auth domain as the API server. And so kubelets and extension API servers I think it's appropriate to make use of this.
But even the extension API servers, if we're doing aggregated, the auth happens before that, and that goes through with a trusted header, right?
If you go through the aggregator, or you can go to them directly, and it will use this to determine who you are. So yeah, both models work. Basically, as evidenced by the fact that it doesn't have an audience field or any audience mechanism, it is assuming homogeneous audience, which is the API, the Kubernetes API.
Okay. So if I put together a PR that said, that tried to sort of, warn users, hey, this is dangerous, here be dragons, to some degree, would that be something that somebody would be up for reviewing?
Yeah, I mean, I think we'd want to give detail about why it's dangerous. It's
for
the APIs.
I'm just
the
thinking
API auth domain. Yeah.
It's worth detailing, and concretely, I'm just afraid that people will see this being used in some place, and this will be a pattern that'll viral out, and then all of a sudden, people are passing around auth tokens willy-nilly.
Yep.
If only there was a way to add audience to JOTs.
I'm with you, Mike. We're not there yet. Right now, we have this thing, and it's very convenient to pass this around, and the token review API makes it a hell of a lot even more convenient than that.
Yep.
So. Okay, I will put it on my list at some point, maybe in the next cycle, to actually get that into the docs.
Okay.
And can I get a buddy to help me review it?
Yeah, you can tag me or.
Yeah, I can review.
All right, thanks, guys.
All right, well, we are out of time. This is good. Keep in mind the timeframes for 1.9, design stuff especially. Let's get out early so we can get feedback and not be trying to review designs and implementations at the same time. That's not great. And try to get some of this stuff knocked out in 1.9. I appreciate it.